The college football playoff picture is rapidly evolving in this college football season. And since it's a 12-team playoff, there's even more moving parts than there have been in the last 10 seasons. And so for that reason, I think it's time to take a look, reassess what the playoff field is looking like, and get a real good picture of what this playoff race is currently looking like. Today, we're going to go conference by conference and then do the group of 5 all at once as well and look at where each conference is sitting in terms of which teams are contending for the playoff, which teams could make it, and ultimately which teams I would pick if I had to today. So we start in the ACC. The ACC has got 3 teams that I would identify as college football playoff contenders: Louisville, Miami, and Clemson. Now, as I film this video, Louisville coming off a tough road loss to Notre Dame, but I still think they're one of the front runners in this conference. Notre Dame is a non-conference game that helps them out. Clemson also is a non-conference loss to Clemson, but in this conference, you're talking about Miami really being the top contender despite their performance against Virginia Tech last week, and then Clemson and Louisville are up there as well. Teams that I think still factor into the race, whether it be for a good start or for a team that I think is just capable of making a run. Boston College is in that conversation. They're just a team that hasn't taken many losses yet and is undefeated in conference play right now, which is reason to believe maybe they could be onto something. Virginia Tech, that loss to Miami was their first conference loss of the season. If they could get their momentum back into those sails and they could play like they did against Miami, they could potentially make a run and be an exciting team we're talking about that factors into the ACC title race, and as a result of that, also be in the playoff race, because winning the ACC in all likelihood is going to get you a playoff spot. You've got Syracuse. Syracuse is a team that took a tough loss earlier this season to Stanford, but they still have all their goals in front of them and could definitely still factor in the race. You look at their schedule, it's pretty manageable. SMU's a team that already had a manageable schedule as well, and with the way they've looked the last couple of weeks, they're looking a lot more like the team people thought they would be in the preseason. So SMU could be in that race. Pitt, probably realistically, is maybe a tier lower, but I'm just trusting in Pat Narduzzi. Maybe they're turning things around. They're still undefeated this season, so Pitt's a team that could totally factor in the playoff race. And then in terms of not a threat, I know Duke is undefeated, and that might seem a little disrespectful, but for the Blue Devils, they really have not played anyone so far, and I assume that's going to crumble down the stretch. NC State is just terrible this season. Stanford and Virginia, shout out to them. They've gotten solid conference victories, but I truly don't trust those teams long term. And then Cal's another team that I think they could certainly be a threat to beat some teams, but I don't think they're necessarily a threat to push for an ACC title. And then there's Georgia Tech, whose schedule is just too tough. The schedule is not favorable for them at all. And for that reason, I just don't think they'll be factoring into the race. And then no chance. North Carolina's looked horrible. Wake Forest hasn't looked great either. They just lost to Louisiana. And then Florida State, my goodness, they are just a complete dumpster fire disaster. So I don't think they'll factor into the race either. But let's talk about some of the key games that are upcoming in the ACC. If I told you the results to just these 6 games in the ACC, you could probably guess who makes the playoff out of the ACC. We've got Miami with a road test at Cal. That's College Game Day that happens this week. That will tell us if Cal is legit. That will tell us if Miami is continuing to stay unscathed. They've also got a road game at Louisville as well. That one's a major, major battle. Could be an ACC title race elimination game, as could Louisville at Clemson, another massive game, as well as Clemson at Virginia Tech. It'll be a game that tells us whether or not Virginia Tech is to be taken seriously, to be trifled with in conference play. There's Syracuse at Boston College, which is just a shout out to some of those teams that are in the race. Maybe the winner of that game could catapult themselves to a nice season. And then another one, Pitt at SMU. Is Pitt legit? Can they get a road win versus SMU, or does SMU continue on their hot streak and make a push? For the ACC, I kind of subscribed to the belief that they were going to be a one-bid conference for a long time this offseason, but with how Clemson is streaking right now, I actually think I'm going to pick 2 playoff teams from this conference. I'm going to pick Miami and Clemson as my 2 playoff picks right now if I'm being forced to make a pick right now. Next up, we've got the Big Ten. Now, in the Big Ten, I think there's a very clear top tier in this conference that's got Penn State, Ohio State, and Oregon. Those are the top college football playoff contenders. We haven't necessarily seen Ohio State get tested yet this year or have to beat anyone of note. And Penn State probably has the most impressive win of the teams in this tier, but we know based off of the preseason expectations and what these teams are made of that they're the top college football playoff contenders. The teams that factor into the race is a pretty hefty tier for the Big Ten. heftier than it usually is. I think Michigan and USC are closer than anyone else in this tier to being in that college football playoff contenders tier. They've just both been dinged with a loss, and it's going to be tough for them to fight through. But you've got the surprises. Rutgers, a huge surprise this year. Indiana, a huge surprise this year. There's a lot of people that are putting a lot of momentum towards Indiana potentially being a playoff team, which is pretty crazy to hear. And then you've got Iowa and Nebraska, both teams with fantastic defenses that think they've figured something out offensively this year. Iowa obviously is measuring it by a bit of a different standard. Nebraska, I think, in a good spot. They've got a manageable schedule. That big matchup between Rutgers and Nebraska will be key this week. But then there's the teams that I don't think are a threat. I know it might seem kind of disrespectful to have Illinois in there, even though they beat Nebraska. But for Illinois, they just have a much tougher schedule down the stretch. They're going to have to play a lot more Big Ten contenders, and they've already had to play Penn State too. I believe they still have Oregon and Michigan on the schedule, which is why Illinois is a tier lower. Washington has been very unimpressive. Maryland, it's clearly not going to be their year, as is the case with Wisconsin as well. And then there's the no chance tier. A lot of teams that I don't think have any chance. Purdue, UCLA, Northwestern are pretty bad. And then for Minnesota and Michigan State, they've just taken a couple tough early losses in the season that show you they probably don't have what it takes to make a push for a playoff spot in the Big Ten. Some of the key games in this conference: Ohio State at Oregon, massive. Oregon at Michigan, absolutely gigantic. Michigan at Ohio State at Penn State. It is awesome seeing this round robin between all those contenders, though. Those are some of the biggest games of the entire season, and a rivalry game sandwiched in there as well. Nebraska at Indiana is one that you wouldn't have circled in the offseason, but here it is, and it's one of the biggest games in determining what the pecking order will be in the Big Ten. And then Penn State at USC, I think, is going to be critical. Can the Trojans rebound from that loss to Michigan and turn their season around? Penn State hosting Ohio State, they probably feel like this is their year to make their push. And out of this conference, I think I've got 4 playoff picks. I think Ohio State, Penn State, Oregon, and then the big surprise, I think USC is going to be a team that makes the college football playoff out of the Big Ten. I think they might get dinged with one more loss at 10-2. I think the Trojans can still make it, and I think they can end the season with a really impressive win over Notre Dame. At that point, that could be a playoff play-in game, and I think the Trojans are capable of doing it. As for Ohio State, Oregon, and Penn State, I don't think it's a hot take to say any of those 3 teams will make the college football playoff. I think they all will. This takes us to the Big 12, a chaotic conference that I think the contenders list is one of the hardest lists to make right now. If I had to pick some teams, I would go with Iowa State and BYU, which is mostly out of respect to the fact that they've stayed undefeated, but they also have impressive wins. BYU is the win over Kansas State and the win over SMU. Iowa State has the big win over Iowa, and they really haven't let inferior opponents stick around with them for the most part. And then I'd say Kansas State. Kansas State is a team that I still think is a top-tier contender. I think they showed it against Oklahoma State last week with the way they dismantled them. And then you've got this next tier that is just an absolute mess. You've got a team in Utah where we have no idea what the quarterback health situation is, and they're just a completely different team with Isaac Wilson at quarterback. You've got Arizona in there, a team that defensively has been a little inept at times this season, but offensively is super awesome. And then last week puts up an insane defensive performance against Utah. That could have been 2 things at play, both Isaac Wilson and the Arizona defense stepping up, and Isaac Wilson being bad, I should say. UCF is a team, very inconsistent, just lost to Colorado. Colorado has to beat Baylor on a Hail Mary, but gets the impressive win over UCF. West Virginia's in this tier after a couple early losses. TCU also lost a few weird ones, including blowing a huge lead versus UCF. Oklahoma State, I can't tell if they're good or bad. They've been blown out by Kansas State. They lose to Utah. They nearly lose to Arkansas, but they've also clutched up in some ways this season. And then there's Texas Tech. They lose an early game to Washington State, but they're back in the race. The moral of the story in the Big 12 is no one's ever really out of the race. Any of those teams that I just listed in that tier could probably win the conference, and that's why they're in this tier. Not a threat. I'm going to say Cincinnati and Arizona State. They both had really nice starts to the season. They've both taken a loss or 2 so far, and I just think they're not quite good enough to factor into the race, but both certainly could finish above some of the teams in the tier above them and could end up turning in a solid bowl season. I think they're both talented teams, and they're both well-coached teams. More so, Arizona State, I think, is well-coached. Cincinnati might be a little bit more of a stretch. I do respect Scott Satterfield, and I do think he's done a nice job acquiring talent for that team, but I think the jury's still out on him at Cincinnati. And then for the no chance tier, Kansas has just taken too many losses. Baylor's not good, and Houston is one of the worst power conference teams. I would be confident to say the worst at the bottom of the Big 12. Key games remaining down the stretch. I mean, it's almost comical trying to cram it all into just 6 key games because there's so many swing games. But BYU hosting Arizona is certainly a big one. The Holy War is going to be massive. Iowa State at Utah as well, so the Utes getting a few big games at home. Oklahoma State TCU is a fun rivalry that will also be a huge swing game. Texas Tech at Arizona is this weekend, and then in 2 weeks, Kansas State at Colorado. Are the Buffaloes legit? If I told you the results of these 6 games, you'd probably have a really good idea of who's winning the Big 12, but it would still be difficult. Out of the Big 12, I think this is going to be your one bid conference, and I think it's going to be Iowa State. The Cyclones, a team I picked to make the Big 12 title game in the offseason, and Utah I had winning it. Utah doesn't have a quarterback right now. My gut still tells me to go with Kansas State, but I'm just going to show my respect to Iowa State because of who I think they can be this season at peak efficiency, and they're still undefeated. Kansas State has that lapse on the road versus BYU, but if I were to say who would more likely be it, probably Kansas State, but let's be fun here. I'm going to rock with the Cyclones. Next up, we have the SEC. The SEC with 4 teams that I think are going to be college football playoff contenders this season. Top-tier contenders, Texas, Georgia, Tennessee, Alabama. I don't think anyone's going to push back on any of those 4 teams. And then, of course, there's those that factor into the race as well. I think LSU is still a team that factors in despite that early loss to USC. Ole Miss, despite coming off of a loss to Kentucky last week. Missouri, despite looking shaky. Texas A&M, despite their early loss to Notre Dame. And Oklahoma, despite all of the above, looking shaky and suffering an early loss to Tennessee. I think all those teams could still factor in the race, and there's a scenario where down the stretch they start to improve things and give themselves an opportunity to make a push. In terms of the teams that aren't a threat, South Carolina's a great story. I think they could win quite a few games in conference play, but I don't think that there's a scenario where they factor into that race at all. Same with Kentucky. Kentucky's a good team, surprisingly. After getting boat raced by South Carolina, it looked like the season might be over, but they've been fighting, and they obviously just beat Ole Miss. They fought against Georgia. I think they can win a bunch of conference games as well, get to a bowl game, but out of the conference title race, I think, and then that is the case for Arkansas and Florida. I think they're also teams that could win some games. I'm less optimistic about both of those teams because bad things just seem to happen to them, but they're not really a threat either. Then we have the no chance tier. Mississippi State is terrible. Vanderbilt might be better than Mississippi State this year. Auburn's also terrible. So Vanderbilt's in a position where they could end up being like only the 3rd worst team in the SEC, which would be crazy. They still have obviously some games they would need to win for that to be the case. But we look at the key games. This is kind of like the Big 12 in my opinion. It's comical to try and squeeze it in just 6 games to determine what's going to happen here, but definitely some big ones. 3 games for Georgia, 2 of them for Bama, 1 at Tennessee. Seeing Tennessee a couple times. Texas game against Georgia is massive. And then a couple of Ole Miss games to see if the Rebels are still legit. I think we're going to get 4 playoff teams out of this conference too, and I think it's going to be Alabama, Texas, Tennessee, and LSU. I think the hot take here is the LSU Tigers. I don't feel like there's a ton of pushback on the other 3 right now. For LSU, that early loss to USC, I just think that USC loss will age well as the Trojans continue to rack up wins, and I think this is an LSU team that is quietly rounding out to a pretty solid squad. They're playing good defense, and they're offensively cooking, and I think you look back at some of their games that quote-unquote didn't age well, like the road game at South Carolina, and you realize, well, Kentucky just beat Ole Miss, and that's a team that got blown out by South Carolina. So could South Carolina just be playing a lot better than people think right now? I think that's the mentality I kind of have about LSU right now, and I think it's a team that will continue to improve as the season goes on, and for that reason, I've got them in my playoff. So this takes us into the group of 5 race. This, of course, factors in a 12-team playoff era. They're going to get at least 1 bid. Could technically get more, but it's probably just going to be 1. So group of 5-ish. This includes the independents in the Pac-2 as well in there. For this, I only really included teams that people would widely consider to at least be in the race and then tiered them based off of that. So, like, for example, the no chance tier are just teams that you could probably hear their name shouted out, like, oh, Sam Houston and the CUSA, they're off to a good start. Western Kentucky, another front runner near the CUSA. I think they're both in that bottom tier because we're not going to see a CUSA team that's not named Liberty in the race. Navy's also in the bottom there. I just think that Newberry squad is kind of a mirage early in the season. And Toledo out of the MAC, I don't think we're going to see a MAC team representing, especially with how poorly they flopped after a couple of signature wins. But in the not a threat tier, I would say Memphis. Their defense just is not good enough, clearly, after getting blown out or a ton of points dropped on them versus Navy. I guess it wasn't necessarily a blowout. And then James Madison. They had a really flashy performance against North Carolina, but I think that's a North Carolina team that's kind of deflated. And also in the Sun Belt, I feel like things are just going to cannibalize themselves there, and I feel like James Madison's going to get dinged with a couple losses. For factoring into the race, I've got both the Pac-2 teams here. They both have taken a loss, and it's not a bad loss. Oregon State with a loss to Oregon, Washington State with a loss to Boise State. They're both just going to need to win out if they want to make the college football playoff. It will take 11-1 with no conference title game shot. I just think that's a bit of a longer shot, but they will factor into that race. Army's a team that I think is really excellent, and they're capable of running the table in the American, as well as Tulane. After 2 tough non-conference losses, Tulane not as high, though, because they've taken those losses, and I think the committee still sticks to a mindset of you are what your record says you are for a lot of the time, and that's the only reason Liberty's in the college football playoff contenders tier. They have no business being there. They're once again playing the weakest schedule in the entirety of college football, and yet they could get in if they go undefeated. They just had their toughest game of the season canceled, and so they're effectively in a position to make a run. UNLV, I think if UNLV goes undefeated, or even if they finish with a loss and maybe even 2 losses, no one can rival their resume, especially if they're able to beat Syracuse this weekend. They'll have wins over Syracuse, Houston, Kansas. If they even just split with Boise State, lose during the regular season, winning the conference title game, there's no way their resume can get rivaled. And then for Boise State, they'll have an opportunity to play and beat UNLV, and they'll have an opportunity in the Mountain West. They've already got the spotlight on them. Their loss isn't that bad either. And then you've got Notre Dame as well in here. They're a team with only 1 loss, and they're started to recover their season, a key win over Louisville now. So the Fighting Irish, certainly a team that could factor in as well. We get to the key games. There are 6 games here that I think would be key. It includes the one Pac-12 game this year, Wazoo against Oregon State. Memphis at Tulane is a big one in the American. That Boise State UNLV game is massive. Liberty's biggest game of the season is going to be at Sam Houston. It's their last game of the season. That's their toughest remaining game on the schedule. So Sam Houston, at the very least, could disrupt Liberty's playoff shot. And then a couple of Notre Dame games. The one versus USC that I talked about earlier that I think could be a playoff play-in game. And then Army against Notre Dame, seeing what Army is really made of. Navy also plays Notre Dame, so keep an eye out for that one as well. If I had to pick a team for now, I'd go with UNLV. I think Boise State no doubt has the better player, and they could be a better team. But the fact that they're playing in Las Vegas, the fact that UNLV already has those quality wins, if they can even beat Boise State in the regular season and then lose to them in the conference title game, I think I'd still take UNLV with how great their resume looks right now. Just no one else at this level is capable of rivaling it, and it would take several UNLV losses to knock them out. So those are the key games in the group of 5, and that's who I think will make it out of that field, UNLV. And so just for fun, I'll show you the projected 12-team field based off of those picks. We've got Texas, Iowa State, Ohio State, and Miami with the first-round byes, and then the first-round matchups. Tennessee has to travel into Autzen to play the Oregon Ducks. I think that's a really fun battle between a couple of big brands, and I remember watching Oregon and Tennessee play a couple times when I was a kid growing up. Those were some pretty iconic matchups. You've got UNLV traveling on the road to play Alabama. I mean, that's just a tough break for UNLV, but I think no matter who is in that 5-seed spot, it's going to be a tough matchup. USC at Clemson would be the other pick. That one I think is an interesting one going into Death Valley. Would be the Trojans in that case. And then LSU at Penn State. I think another really fun brand clash. And then Penn State home game in the playoffs will feed families, basically. And so just for fun, just for kicks and giggles, I'll throw some playoff predictions at you. I think we could see Tennessee getting a fun road game victory, but the rest of the home teams winning. The Ducks have just looked a little too soft for my liking in the early going. No chance UNLV pulls an upset. I really like Penn State and Clemson, what they've showed offensively this season. Clemson has really been hitting a new stride, but I would probably have Penn State and Ohio State prevailing in those second-round games. Miami, I think, is an excellent team, but I don't know if they could go toe-to-toe with the physicality of a team like Penn State. And like I said, Penn State's explosiveness has been really, really awesome to watch this season under Andy Kotelnicki. Bama and Texas, I think, come out of the other side of the bracket. As much as I would love to see Iowa State pull off a shocker, it's not going to happen. And in the Natty, I think we'll see Texas versus Ohio State. In regards to the differences between Bama and Texas right now, I don't think there's many, but I do think Bama has some flaws that are capable of being exposed, and so does Texas, to be fair. But Texas, we just haven't seen play the same necessarily caliber opponent. They haven't played Georgia yet, but when they do play Georgia, I suspect we'll learn a lot more about the Longhorns. I just like the Longhorns' versatility and their depth, and I feel like that could be a weakness Bama potentially has, is depth. as we go throughout the season because of the way they had to build that roster. And then we got Texas versus Ohio State. I think Ohio State might be the best team in the country this season. But I just love the way this Texas roster was built a little bit more. So my technical kind of pick for the national championship, I'll rock with it, would be Texas as my updated prediction. The elephant in the room might be me picking Georgia to miss the playoffs now, and I just think there's a lot of flaws with Georgia this season, and they also have a really tough schedule. So that's kind of the mindset and mentality I'm in at this point. But as usual, if you enjoyed the video, go ahead, like, comment, subscribe, do all the good stuff. And this is a regular season sport after all. So this is nothing more than a fun thought exercise. We've got some regular season games we still got to get through before we think about any of this playoff stuff. So let me know down in the comments what you agreed with. I'm sure you disagreed with plenty. And I will see you guys later this week.